Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, whatever time of day it is that you're joining us here. So I'm here to talk to you today about a very important historical event that I think is one of the most important historical events, and it doesn't receive the recognition that it should. And I'm just going to do this off the cuff. It's just something that came to me that I thought was terribly important, and I want to share it with you. And hopefully, it'll help to educate those who haven't heard of this event before. And for those who have, maybe it'll shed a little bit more light onto it. So I'm filming this on October 10th, but I'm going to actually publish this on October 11th. And what happened today in 1869 was a key catalyst in defining how modern Canada would look. On October 11th, 1869, Louis Riel, with a group of other Métis, went to a close relative's farm and stood on the chains. That's why we refer to today as the day when Louis Riel stood on the chains. So what does that mean? Well, we have to go back into 1868 when Canada undertook to annex the Northwest Territories, or sorry, the Northwest, what might be known as Rupert's Land, which up until that point had been controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. They entered into agreement during negotiations in late 1868, 1869, to pay 300,000 pounds, British pounds, to the Hudson's Bay Company in order to take over control of Rupert's Land. So at the time, Rupert's Land was what we now know as Northwestern Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and what is now the Northwest Territories and Nunavut and Nunavik. The Yukon Territory, pardon me. So when they did that, though, they didn't consult anybody. They didn't consult any of the inhabitants, none of the First Nations, none of the other inhabitants. And a key element of the population was the population at Fort Garry. So Fort Garry is what is now referred to as Winnipeg, but Fort Garry at the time was this Hudson's Bay Company trading post that was located at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers. And the shell of that fort still exists, but it was essentially the commercial, economic, political, cultural center of the Northwest. At the time, there were settlements throughout the region, but really Fort Garry, now Winnipeg, was let's say, the capital of the continental interior of British North America. And the population there was predominantly Métis. So who are the Métis? The Métis are an Indigenous people of Canada, and as you can see, I'm proudly wearing my Manitoba Métis Federation shirt here. They are an Indigenous people, and a lot of people think erroneously that Métis are simply people who are the progeny of a European father and a First Nations mother. So even today, there are people who are saying that because my father was European or colonial or settler, or whether they were British or French or whatnot, even if it's like they're alive now and they're talking about their current father and their mother was First Nations, that they are Métis, and nothing could be further from the truth. There's an aspect of that, certainly, as fur traders, specifically British and French, moved into the continental interior. They did strike up relationships with First Nation women. They were married, maybe not in a Christian religious term, but they got married as per the customs of the land at the time, and they had offspring. And so there's an element of that. But the Métis people developed throughout over decades, over 100 years, a common culture. They were bound together with a common language, Michif. There was also Bungi, which was a mixture of English and First Nations languages, but mostly Michif. And by the back half of the 1860s, the Métis had developed this common culture, common traditions, a common outlook, and they were essentially a new people. They were They formed a new nation in the Northwest, and the vast majority of the population at Fort Garry in 1869 were Métis, predominantly French Roman Catholic Métis, but also there were English Protestant, mostly Scottish Métis. So the Canadian government, the British government, and the Hudson's Bay Company didn't consult any of them. And in the summer of 1869, the Dominion of Canada sent surveyors to the Red River settlement. The Red River settlement was essentially this Métis settlement, or predominantly Métis settlement at the forks of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, and started to lay out farms in the square grid pattern that was in use in Ontario. That's all they knew. Up until that point, farms in the Red River settlement had been long and narrow, very more similar to the farm plots in Quebec that were long and narrow. They each shared a frontage on a river, and then they were long, narrow plots that went out from there. And they started surveying these lots in anticipation of this onslaught of settlement from Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and overseas. And in some cases, they ran these survey markers right over top of land that had already been cultivated, sometimes for years, by Métis inhabitants. So one farmer in particular, a man named Andre Nault, had woke up one day and the Dominion surveyors were surveying across his land. So he put out the call for help, and Louis Riel, with a band of other Métis, showed up on the scene and confronted the surveyors and essentially stood on the chains and stopped the surveying, and eventually dispatched the Dominion surveyors, not in a violent way, but the Dominion surveyors gave up and went back to their quarters. So why is this important? Because I feel that this was the actual start of the Red River resistance. It was from this point that a series of events that I won't go into in detail here began, in which the Red River resistance broke out. Negotiations began between the provisional government of Assiniboia, led by Louis Riel, in Fort Garry, which was this provisional government that the Métis and other inhabitants created to represent themselves. And these negotiations took place in Ottawa, and eventually the government in Ottawa passed the Manitoba Act. And the Manitoba Act was based on a list of a Bill of Rights that were demanded by the inhabitants of the Northwest that were their prerequisites for entering Confederation. So it all started, I feel, with this one event of Louis Riel stepping on chains and indicating in a very physical, overt way that the inhabitants of the Northwest just were not going to just peacefully allow their cultures, their rights, their traditions to be trampled by an incoming power from the East, and that it overtly and manifestly indicated that they would have to be treated with, they would have to be negotiated with for entry into Confederation. So that's why I think on October 11th, it is a day of national historical significance in my mind. I believe it should be recognized as such, and I'm going to undertake to recommend it to be recognized as a national historical event. Perhaps somebody's already started, I don't know. I've reached out to the minister responsible at the MMF. Sadly, he hasn't responded to either one of my emails, volunteering to actually undertake this work on behalf of the MMF. So I'll just do it myself, and we'll see where we go. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, there it is. I know I went very, very briefly over it. I don't want this video to be any more than 10 minutes. So, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And this is my first YouTube video. Not my first, but first kind of longish one. So, yeah, here, I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much. Like and subscribe, as some of my favorite commentators say. All right, take care. Have a great day.